Perfect.
Oops, I'm going
Uh,
to continue.
oh yeah, just click continue.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. 1 second. I'm just writing a note down real quick. Okay. So I'm gonna start the beginning here, kind of introduce saying hi to everyone, and then
Sure.
Ben, where do you want to be affiliated with for this, or do you just want to be like arts advocate for the state?
I'm retired from the Missouri Alliance for Arts Education
Okay.
and continue working with Missouri Citizens for the Arts as a liaison to the Alliance right now. That's, I guess, my official position.
It's Missouri Alliance for
Arts
Arts
Education.
Arts Education. Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, and I still continue to serve as the advocacy captain for the state of Missouri
Uh-huh.
with America for the Arts. Way
Okay.
too many syllables. Way too many
Yeah.
syllables.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. Got it. Okay. Cool. Okay. So I'm gonna do like a welcome to everyone, and then we'll get started. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We have a very special guest in our continuation of our advocacy discussion series in Ben Martin. He is retired from the Missouri Arts Alliance for Education. He still serves as a liaison for that organization to Missouri Citizens for the Arts, as well as he is the Missouri State Captain for AFTA, Americans for the Arts. So he has a long history as an arts supporter, an arts advocate, and someone who is really in the trenches. In addition to that, Ben has also had the rare opportunity to serve as a few of us have in the ability to craft a policy agenda and help determine policy for a presidential campaign or any campaign for that matter. And that is going to be the bulk of our discussion today. Ben's work with the Biden campaign, crafting the agenda, discussing legislation that the agenda hopes to address, and the needs that it hopes to serve, particularly for the arts community, not only of our nation, but particularly of our area and our states because of his history here. I should say before we get started that Arts KC has reached out to all of the campaigns that are running currently for the office of president. We have not heard back from any of them, but we welcome a conversation with any campaign of any party. This is not an endorsement of Vice President Biden's campaign for president, though we are very aware of this agenda and what that would mean for the arts given the potential for a Biden administration. So with that, welcome, Ben. Thank you so much for joining us today and discussing this important issue and this really, really thoughtful stance on the arts, not only as a cultural institution, but as an economic driver and as something that is, like so many other sectors, heavily hit by the COVID outbreak and then the subsequent economic fallout because of that. So thank you for joining us and discussing that with us today. To get us started, Ben, can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with the campaign from the beginning? So how were you brought into the fold to discuss this important document?
Well, Robert Lynch, who's the head of Americans for the Arts, I think is the one who put together a lot of the people who are going to be a part of this policy committee, the Arts Policy Committee. And so he chose a number of us who were advocacy captains from around the country. And so I was fortunate enough to get the letter and the request to join. And I said, well, sure, I'll go ahead and do that.
Yeah, and it's always an interesting day when you get those kinds of phone calls because it, like I said in the opening, it is a rare experience to help craft a statement and an agenda from the ground up like that. And really, an agenda for those who may not be aware is really, as I think of it, a statement of priorities. You know, we say
Right.
we say in politics that a budget is a statement of your priorities, of your beliefs, and your ideals. and what you think is important, and a agenda is very similar. It's a
Hmm.
statement of what you think, of what you deem to be important given a particular sector or a particular topic. And then it does break down into legislation that's either been introduced, legislation that's been passed previously, legislation that's pending. It lays out a campaign, a candidate, or an organization like Arts KC. We have our own policy agenda, what exactly that candidate or that entity believes to be important given that particular sector or topic. So
Right.
Ben, can you talk a little bit about when you all started crafting the agenda, what went into this process, and what your goals were from the outset? What did you want people to take away from this document?
Okay. A lot of the asks that are in the document uh, and policy positions really come out of Americans for the Arts and a lot of the things that Americans for the Arts has been advocating for all along. That was also informed by the COVID pandemic that has hit, because that has changed things around drastically in terms of especially the arts and the performing arts. Uh, as an industry, I think performing arts has probably been impacted more than just about anything else in the country, and probably is going to have the most difficulty coming back. So we have that combination of long-term asks that have been around for quite a while, and then these new new things that have cropped up as well, and some of them not new at all, but just were under the radar for us for way too long. The whole Black Lives Matter movement that has happened, and the need for the arts to really examine what we've been doing in terms of equity, inclusion, diversity, and such has now, I think, become forefront for many of us, and things that we really need to consider
Right.
because we have not done a good job up until this point.
Hmm. And I think also it's important, like you said, things that may have been passive in years prior now, really need to be codified with words and in, documentation.
Yes.
It's not enough oh, we all consider that important, or we all, of course, that matters. We put a lot in an agenda, we put a lot in documentation, and it's
Hmm.
important when things come up societally that it's reflected in the same mechanisms that we try to codify everything else. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because it is important. Looking through this document, or looking through this document, I first am really struck by the depth of the document. We get, I think,
Yeah.
those of us who are outside of DC, we're outside of New York, LA, we're here in the heartland, or we're in what they call the flyover states. We're used to talking about the NEA. We're used to talking about, the Lincoln Center. We're used to talking about these cultural institutions that operate very much outside of our area. But I do see, you mentioned that a lot of the state captains from AFTA were brought in to help craft this. And
Hmm.
I think that's evident in this document, because even though it does talk about, the NEH, the NEA, and it's important to know, for people who don't go to DC very often, when you are there, these entities go from being kind of words on a page to these are real living, breathing facilities and people that they're advocating on the ground pretty much every day for the arts in normal times, at the Hill, or in discussions, in conversations. So they go from kind of these intangible ideas that we see to real in-person structures and infrastructure, and I think that's important for people to realize. And right off the bat, before we get into kind of breaking down the different stances on different topics and platform issues, we go through a really thorough introduction talking about and everything from, like you said, Black Lives Matter and people of color being included, to STEAM, STEAM, of education, pre-K, and then secondary education. Talk about unions, and we talk about the economy, COVID, GDP, etc. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like in crafting this document, in terms of who was at the table and what their expertise were brought to bear, as far as
Sure.
the depth and the overall broadness of this
Okay.
information?
Okay. The committee is huge. It's about 90 or 100 people. It's been kind of varying as some people come in and a couple of other people move off. But so we had a huge committee. We had personalities from the entertainment industry. We had people from academia, people at the state level of government, the federal level of government, advocates of all stripes, educators. A number of educators were involved in it, and so a really good cross section of the arts community across the country, across the nation.
Sure.
And there is I think, a real attempt to, although we're talking about policy that's kind of placed in Washington, D.C., there's a real attempt to make sure that we're talking about policy that impacts people throughout the country.
Right.
And so the document went up on a Google Drive. And so we all had the ability to go in and work on edits and things like that. It started with pretty much just sort of a laundry list of things that have been on there before and things that we thought were new. And then they sort of gave us the go ahead to have at it and see what kind of changes, see what kind of things you would like to include. And so we've been through at least 3 drafts of that. And right now subcommittees are working, excuse me, on some of the specific areas. For example, I'm on the arts education subcommittee.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have lengthened it a little bit by doing that work, and in some cases actually shortened and edited it a little bit as well too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the process that we have gone through. One of lots of different people all together on a huge Zoom call, breaking it down to smaller groups. Lots of word editing, wordsmithing going on, and then back and forth with some, okay, well, what do you think about that? Well, maybe not. Oh yeah, we like this. I'm pleased that a couple of my suggestions that were aimed at kind of involving, as you call, flyover country, and involving people, here in the middle part of the country, were accepted and were put in it. So I feel like I've had input and I've had a valuable role to play. I haven't just been marginalized as one of 90 or 100 people, but I've had some real input.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, that's I think we're all kind of dealing with Google Docs, right now in our lives.
Yeah,
it's an easy way to add, and that's one important Google Doc.
Yeah.
To have circulating around. So, starting with kind of going through some of the different topics and policy items and proposals. I think it's probably not random that the first one is talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. I think for a lot of us, particularly given the climate, that is of paramount importance. Survival may be the first of importance, given COVID and the situation. But this really is something that we all, feel a renewed sense of urgency about. So can you talk a little bit about both, maybe who was kind of crafting this, what that group maybe looked like, and then a little bit about what their goal was with these proposals here, of which I think they are they're broad, but they're important. This one, you could get really in the weeds of doing some voter some John Lewis Voting Rights Act kind of discussions and things like that. But really, this first thing here seems to me just to be kind of a statement of principles rather than a statement of policy issues against legislation.
Yeah. I think it's kind of a clarion call to ourselves.
Sure.
To number one, make sure that we're doing a good job, that we understand what we need to do to make sure that all Americans, regardless of background, of economic ability, of geographical location for that matter, have the ability to participate in the arts. And so I think the campaign is going to adopt this idea of let's include everybody in all of the promises of American culture, American arts, American creativity, for that matter. And so I think what they're trying to say is that any kind of policies that we do come up with are going to be looked at through that lens of, is everyone able to participate in an equitable way, in a way that reaches out to all communities.
And what did the group look like? I'm assuming this was a subcommittee as well. Was it civic leaders? Was it activists? Was it? I mean, I'm assuming they were all artists in some capacity, but maybe not. I know a lot of people who are kind of renewing their calls, as you said, for social justice and racial justice.
Sure.
Some non-artists. So what did that group look like to your knowledge?
Yeah, we have everybody from urban arts organizations and establishments, and we have performers. Some that would be household names. I can't release those at the moment, but a little bit later, I think you'll be able to see who they are. And community activists. It's a wide variety. So it was actually a group that was refreshingly diverse. Time around compared to
maybe one of those more surprisingly diverse groups, particularly given how this normally goes. I mean, if you're drafting, an agenda of economic policies, you're not going to get, you're likely not going to get, someone from, rural agricultural background, but maybe you will,
or arts education. For that.
Exactly. Yeah. So going down to the next issue, the creative economy. And this is something that we stress a lot at Arts KC, because we want artists to feel like they're empowered members of the creative workforce, not just their arts self, but their economic and their workforce self, and that greater body of artists as well. So talk a little bit not only about this section, but also we've got a couple of the pending legislation that's been passed has been introduced into the House, and one in the Senate, the CREATE Act and the PLACE Act. If you can talk a little bit about those as well.
Okay. Ever since Richard Florida first started talking about the creative economy, what is it, 20 years now, I think it is, people have been gravitating to that idea that not only are we talking about just the arts itself, but we're also talking about really using the artistic process to inform the entire economy, and especially to move things forward. So the idea here is to make sure that policy reflects that and does support that. Under the CREATE Act, and I hate to just read from things, but to invest in the creative economy, to recognize artists, entrepreneurs, nonprofit arts organizations as contributors to small business community, support the creative economy through federal programs and actions. And so the CREATE Act is kind of a piece of legislation that pulls together all of the various and sundry programs that are out there in federal legislation and tries to give it a place where it's going to be coordinated and combined. It's been on the horizon, has been proposed in each congressional session, I think for the last 4 or 5 years, and has some just really great possibilities for what we can do if we just marshal all of that energy and put that energy in a coordinated put together in a coordinated way.
Right. I mean, we know AFTA circulates, all the time, the billions of dollars that the creative economy, and they specifically stress just the nonprofit creative economy, lends not only to the nation, to the workforce, but to government revenue. And it's often, it's completely missed by most legislators, most elected officials, that we're talking a lot about incentives for buildings, for new structures, for new, hotels. I mean, we have 2 new big incentives for hotels here in the city. And if we invested a fraction of what we give in incentives for that in the creative economy, we know from research that a lot that AFTA does, that community development really from the ground up is spurred, and unlike a lot of other industries with the creative economy, it is very equitable, and it's easy. It can be easily equitable. So lifting the parts of the community that need the most help, so that all tides kind of lift boats together. And I think that's what the CREATE Act does for me, that I've seen from it. But also as well as the PLACE Act. I think PLACE puts a different emphasis, I think, on entrepreneurship.
Exactly.
It really thinks of not only arts as the cultural institution, particularly of underserved areas, but also as small businesses. And I think that's what's an effective differentiation between the two. And I'm glad to see both of them in here, because I do think both of them independently serve themselves and serve the same community.
The PLACE Act in many ways is exactly what it says. It's a place for that creative entrepreneurship, kind of whatever shape it may take. So many of them are arts activities and arts businesses, but they don't necessarily have to be. So it's both of the pieces of legislation, I think, are well worth taking a look at and trying to incorporate either as independent pieces of legislation themselves or incorporate them into larger pieces.
Yeah, I think it's important. Both of them are of importance. Moving on down, the next section talks about National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities, and I think we talk a lot about these, so we can be brief on this, I think. But biggest difference I see here is the expansion by $1 per capita each, and
which is essentially a doubling of the budget for those two institutions.
Can you talk a little bit about can you talk a little bit about where that monetary, a little bit already are, but about where that came from, that dollar amount came from?
I think that's sort of been something that a lot of arts advocates have been talking about over the years. Can't we at least give $1 of our taxes, everybody, to National Endowment for the for the Arts, National Endowment for Humanities, so on and so forth. We've been settling for actually we've gotten increases the last few years, but they're fairly minute increases when you think of it. 5 million here, 7 million here, so on and so forth. So I think the campaign is going to say we commit to the idea of $1 per capita, which is still, 0.0102 of 1% of the entire federal budget, to support the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. And the thing that we think about those as Washington, D.C., and we think about those as big national programs, but we have to remember that about 13% of the budget for Missouri Arts Council actually comes from the National Endowment for the Arts. And so every dollar that we get in grants to small groups that might be in Mount Vernon, Missouri, or they might be larger groups that are here in Kansas City, some of that money is coming directly through Missouri Arts Council from the National Endowment of the Arts. It does have an impact here in the state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, with COVID especially, the NEA and the NEH, they were the mechanisms by which a lot of that increased funding flowed. So without them, and I think it's important to point out a contrast here. Every budget introduced by the Trump White House, the Trump administration, has zeroed out both of these institutes,
Yes, it has.
as well as PBS and a couple of our NPR, a lot of our national, arts and nonprofit cultural agencies. So I think that's an important contrast to include.
Right.
One,
but I do want to point out that the Congress has never come anywhere close to going along with that, and that has been bipartisan opposition to to zeroing out either of those. So I'm not going to cast any aspersions on Republican members of Congress because they've also been big supporters.
Sure, and I think that speaks to, you know, in times like now where we are as polarized as many people have ever seen us in their lifetimes. You know, we still agree that, both sides can agree that, you know, these institutions should not be completely struck down and zeroed out. One thing I didn't see in here, and with this was something pertinent to specifically to agencies like Arts KC, or you know, entities like Arts KC that function outside of a municipality. We are not affiliated with the city of Kansas City, Missouri. The NEH funding, extra funding flow had restrictions on it to not only grantees within the last few years, but also entities that were part of a municipal government. I didn't see in here, do you know if this addresses that at all, if particularly in the COVID section?
I don't know that. I'm going to make a note about that right now.
Yeah.
maybe we could discuss that.
Yeah, if it wasn't, that was what I was going to say. It might be worth discussing with the greater group about that, because, you know, it did kind of preclude us from, you know, being eligible for that and then being able to re-grant it. And I think that's, you know, a distinction that maybe, you know, isn't necessarily front of mind when drafting legislation like that, and I think could be remedied pretty easily. So that's just one point. Speaking of COVID, we going to the next section about the arts sector and COVID relief. This talks a lot about terms and items that I think the public will be more familiar with now that we've lived with COVID for a while now, unfortunately. But PPP program, loans for borrowers, and more money at the hands of those organizations that are treated as small businesses through this kind of funding. So can you talk a little bit about the urgency that was felt in drafting this legislation, or I mean in drafting this language?
Yeah, and I think it is especially more urgent now because we've had the hang up between Congress and the administration about what actually the next level of relief might look like. And it doesn't look too hopeful for any kind of new legislation to be passed at all.
Sure.
So I think a lot of it extends some of the ideas that were in the original CARES package that happened back in the spring and early summer. The idea of the Paycheck Protection Program, allowing organizations to really protect their workers and find a funding source that would allow their workers to be paid even though that organization is not able to function fully at the stage it is right now. In terms of the unemployment assistance, one of the things, of course, and our listeners probably don't need me to talk about this, is the fact that a gig worker quite often was not eligible for unemployment in the first place. And so the idea that the unemployment assistance get expanded to people who are self-employed, who work on a contract basis, I think is really important to this document. It's definitely talked about in this document and definitely emphasized as something that ought to be done. Let's see. The COVID things that are talked about here especially are increasing and continuing to provide money to NEA, NEH for the grantings that they have done. I know a number of Kansas City organizations have benefited from a $50,000 grant that has come from NEA and has helped kind of tide them over at least for some period of time and being able to continue operations even though there is no revenue coming in for them at that point. So those things are all in that document, and that's been one where it's such a huge area right now in terms of what the economic impact is. They've tried to be as comprehensive as possible with it. I think there's still discussions going on exactly how we can make sure that the arts are treated equitably with the rest of the economy, and also uniquely because of the unique circumstances that arts organizations find themselves in.
I think an important piece to this as well that I think got kind of lost in the COVID discussion is the tax deduction conversation and the reinstatement of the tax deduction for COVID. And this would this agenda calls for the permanent reinstatement of that tax deduction, which gets us closer back to where we were before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. In my previous work, that was a big deal for us in the nonprofit sector for obvious reasons. And I would venture a guess in looking at the tax policy, the greater tax policy of Vice President Biden and candidate Biden, that the overall tax policy would get us, even closer to where we were, and potentially, kind of reversed in some ways from that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, because
one thing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that I'd really like to emphasize is that universal charitable tax deduction. The idea that anybody can, whether they take the standard or not, can then claim some of those charitable tax deductions that they make, not just to arts organizations, but also to any nonprofit organization, whether it be healthcare or charitable giving of various kinds, churches and so on. Would all be included in that. And so I think, again, it helps to incentivize, or it helps to encourage that American sense of we ought to give back, we ought to contribute to good causes anyway. That's kind of a uniquely American thing for us.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's definitely something that's really important. I think I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And I think I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but if people who are following along with us want to go down to G, item G, is all about tax reform. And this is where I would really direct some of our independent artists and our self-employed artists, because this talks a lot about what was further lost in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, as far as tax credit programs, for low-income housing, for tax deductions for paid expenses as a result of your employment. It's a really, really important provision for our sector that I think gets lost in the greater conversation. I think oftentimes when we talk to elected officials and legislators about the arts, the tax usually stops at organizations and the standard deduction and other giving incentives, but really tax reform for the arts specifically goes even deeper into that employment aspect and what's expenses accrued as a result of their employment. So that's a really important section that I am not an accountant. I don't believe you to be an accountant. But I would encourage everyone to look at that based on what they pay now, what they are and are not allowed to deduct now, and size that up as far as the future. So
and one of those tax issues that's just driven me crazy all the years that I've been doing this, and we're finally getting it in a policy document here that this administration, a new administration, would hopefully do, is the one that prevents an artist from deducting the full market value of their work. They can only deduct the amount of what the supplies would cost. So, for example, a painter would be able to deduct the canvas, the framing, and the paint that they use, and that's the cost that they can deduct when they say donate something to a museum or donate something to a group. But if a collector buys the work from them and the collector then donates it, that collector gets to donate the full market value of what one would expect to pay for that kind of work of art. It's just a crazy situation that I definitely puts the artist at a disadvantage in terms of what they can do and what they can do with their work.
There's 16 different policy items in this agenda, so I know we won't touch in depth on every one, but I definitely want to get your take on the section that I'm assuming you had the most investment in and spent the most time on, the arts and education section, which is just one previous in F.
Hmm.
Talk to us a little bit about the creation of this, what went in, and what made it in here, and why a little bit.
Yeah, we've been going around about that, trying to see what can be the best possible way to support arts education on a national level, on a national policy level. I mean, education overall is pretty much a state's responsibility, and in Missouri, definitely a local responsibility for local school boards and such. But there are things that can be done and should be done along the way. So the idea of a national effort to promote STEAM education, science, technology, engineering, the arts, and math, I think is a welcome change. And so we have really some very good programs that are working on STEM. And if you really talk to the people who are in those STEM programs, quite often they will tell you, oh yeah, we're using all kinds of creativity and arts related kind of things anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But some of them are resistant to the idea of that combination. And in some cases, it's just the practitioners don't have a lot of experience in that area. And so bringing in the artist, bringing in the arts teacher or arts educator to be a part of the process, I think can provide a much more well-rounded education for students. And in fact, really, that's a key point of the arts education section anyhow. The idea of still continuing to encourage a well-rounded education for kids. That's what's specified in the Education Act that currently exists, the ESSA, as they call it. But quite often we talk about what we're hearing talked about all the time is workforce development. What we're really talking about is training rather than education. And sure, preparing people for work is important, and we need to do that. But that work preparation also involves skills and concepts and knowledge that's developed through study in the arts and work through the arts as well. And that's something that unfortunately is often missed. And I think we need to emphasize it. If we emphasize it up there, then I think there's much more of a chance to emphasize it at the state and local level too.
Absolutely.
There's also some wonderful little funding things that are in there that would come out of the Department of Education and others that would support programs in arts education, especially special programs that meet special needs that might be really, really innovative and that could possibly be replicated in other places too.
Sure. And I think it's important, the point you made about, an agenda at this level lends credence to discussions at every other level of government. Mm-hmm. And that is often what drives a lot of these national agendas, a lot of, the work of the national organizations like NEA, NEH, is they know that, when things are introduced and are, supported at that level of government, that it makes it easier for those of us who function, at the, smaller, more local areas of government. Yeah. And it only helps that case as well. Mm-hmm. Anything else you want to say about the arts and education? I love one of the last bullet points is support lifelong learning in the arts. Yeah. I think that's important
how long do you have?
Yeah. As someone who's got 2 degrees in arts myself, that's my that's part of my
background. My background, of course, is the old theater teacher and the work there. Yeah, a couple of different things there. Number one, professional development for teachers. Quite often, people see professional development being funneled to other tested areas, not the arts areas, mm-hmm. And so making that an equitable distribution there as well. And then there's actually some interesting stuff in there about juvenile justice and utilizing the arts within the juvenile justice system to sort of steer some of those young folks away from some choices that they've made in life and open up some other different possibilities.
Mhm.
So young people have all these different kinds of skills and abilities there, and if they were just given some encouragement and some support to utilize them, I think they can be and moving in lots of different directions that are constructive for themselves, for their communities, for their families, across the spectrum. That lifelong learning thing is just something that I think we need to be aware of in every aspect of our life. Once we stop learning, then pretty much we stop growing, and yeah, I think anything that we can do in order to encourage people at all levels um, of development, all ages, if you will,
Mhm.
to be involved. That's important. There's some great programs that are being done out of Missouri Arts Council right now with senior arts and and those kind of developments that I think are really exciting.
Yeah, it's I'm so glad you brought both those points up, particularly the juvenile uh, provision as well, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. You know,
Hmm.
this calls for $61 million influx through the Title V portion of that organization. And you know, sometimes these are line items on a paper that don't mean much kind of in the practical sense of, or it's hard to kind of see the future in a practical sense from a line item on one of these documents. And that would be, you know, that would be revolutionary. I mean, that would be, you know, one of those things that you have no idea what it could change,
Exactly.
what it could
Hmm.
help, and it's one part of a 11-page document, you know. And I think it's just one of the many pieces of this that are that is so thoughtful and detailed in a way that, you know, we just don't think about most of the time when we're in, you know, in our grind and we're working on some, you know, we're very reactionary often in arts advocacy, and as we should be, because there's a lot happening usually. But
That we
this is
have to react to.
yeah, this is something that, you know, we do not have any idea how that could affect the future and what benefit that could have for us. You know, as well as, like you said, the programs, as someone who who recently lost a grandfather to Alzheimer's, you know, there's no telling what his life would have, you know, the last part of his life could have looked like had provisions and programs like that been, you know, more accessible and
Hmm.
earlier on. So I think it's part of the greater document here that is so thoughtful, and going on to, you know, the rest of it, you know, we go from arts education uh, to immigration, to the visa process, to workers here, you know, short-term workers here, and visa workers here, to arts in the health, arts in the
Hmm.
military, even arts in transportation and infrastructure,
Yep.
which is so interesting. And then um, the section in, I think another such a thoughtful inclusion of maximizing the earning ability of arts organizations, and this talks about not only the economic blueprint of the nonprofit arts entities, um, but talks about net neutrality.
Yep.
And you know, that's so important too for creating that, like we said, that equitable arts impact from not only the coast but in the
Hmm.
central part of the United States. Then we go into the federal arts jobs program, which is very lengthy, and um, this talks about protections within the arts jobs market. And then last, we finish with equitable healthcare. Um, this, like I've said, this is a really long document that I hope people um, dive deep into, really sink their teeth into. Is there any other section of this that you really want to hit before we end, that you think is either a new focus, something that we should be turning our attention to, or is an in-depth focus of something that we've talked a lot about as a sector?
Take a look at Section E, because I think this is something to me that I think is just so unique. We're one of the few countries in the Western Hemisphere, really in the developed world, that does not have a Department of Cultural, Creative Arts, whatever you want to call it. And so this calls for the creation of a cabinet level post that's the Presidential Arts Advisor, similar to the President's Science Advisor. And it brings into the White House a real focus on what are we going to be able to do for the artistic, the creative side of our culture, and how can we keep that in front of people and emphasize for people that it is an important part of who we are and what we're all about. We've heard so many people talk about, in the past, we don't remember the person who owned this particular shop or that particular business or paved this particular road. What we do remember is who wrote this particular play or made this great painting or this great statue. Those are the things that still exist from those cultures of the past. And the things that I think we need to be aware of, those are the things that we're going to be remembered by too. And we need to celebrate those and emphasize those and support those. So I think really in some ways, all of what we're talking about here in terms of this policy statement that is being put together with all the 16 points that are there, I think in many ways they hinge on the success of getting the President's Arts Advisor in there and being able to start pushing some of those ideas forward in many ways. Yeah. Otherwise, overall,
day one too on that.
Oh yeah. Let's get it day one.
Yeah. So it's fast action there.
But in many cases, the other points seek to reverse or correct strange little regulations that have gotten put in place that ended up, in some cases, not intentionally harming artists and arts institutions. So, for example, when we became much more careful about our security in terms of letting people into the country, and especially visas that we would grant, unintentionally, quite often somebody that we wish to bring in as a guest artist, a performer, whatever, had all kinds of trouble getting in. And there have been many instances where concerts have actually had to be canceled because the guest artist who was supposed to play with that symphony orchestra or with that particular band weren't able to get there in time. And so things fell apart that way. I don't think it was intended to have that impact, but it ended up having that impact. And up and down the list, you can see these little regulations that need to be cleaned up or need to be rewritten so that they don't unintentionally impact the arts the way they have been. Right.
And tying that into the previous section about the arts secretary for what would be a President Biden, it's so important. We talk a lot in other areas about representation. And for me, it's so important to have that person there because they are a direct conduit to the president from our sector. And that is where issues like these little things that you just mentioned can get addressed quickly, because often they, like you said, they can be unintended consequences and therefore more easily remedied than other sweeping legislation that will have opposition, strong opposition or support, etc. And that to me is almost one of the more important aspects of having that kind of representation in the White House at the cabinet level for President Biden. So
sure.
It all is important. So I encourage, as we wrap up here, this will be made available as soon as it's able to be made public. And when that happens, to those who are listening, please look at this document. Please review it to make an informed decision. please review it. Should Biden become our president, this will directly inform the decisions that he makes, the policies and proposals that he introduces.
Hold him to it.
Yeah,
Hold him to it.
That is exactly right. As was announced, the joint task force between him and some of his primary opponents. It is there to hold the leader accountable, to hold that person who holds the highest office accountable for what they've said, as they've listed as a priority beforehand. And that's what's so great about these thoughtful documents. Ben Martin, thank you so much for joining us. The week of September 14th is Arts Education Week. So we wish you a happy Arts Education Week. We at ArtsKC know how important arts education is, and you can look directly into this document and see the good that can come from thoughtful leadership, thoughtful intentional proposals and priorities included herein. So I'll give you the last word about what you think about what you think the importance of this document is, and its existence.
Yeah, the document is a blueprint for how the federal government ought to approach the arts and culture within the United States. It is not something that is going to poof magically appear on the very first day. Some things can, but not everything. Right. It's going to be a work in progress, and obviously needs to work through the whole legislative process as well. But it gives us a rallying point. It gives us a call of this is what we envision. And so in that way, it's aspirational. And what we need to do is to make it come to life in terms of reality and real policy and real legislation. So
sure.
Hope everybody can be involved in it.
Yeah, and I hope that I hope people will take this and will truly digest it in that way. So thank you so much for joining us, Ben, and we look to you as an advocate and a resource often, and never more so than now. And we wish you all the best, and we hope that we see continued successes up and down at every level of government in this country. So thank you so much, Ben, and we will talk again to you soon. And everyone, this will be available on our website, this recording, and we hope that this has been informative. A reminder that this is just one in a series of discussions we're having. This one we made private because we recorded this when we were able to, and we wanted to make it available when this was going to be able to be made public. But the rest of this series we hope to be interactive and in person and engaging in that way. But we wanted to get the information before as soon as we could, so that it wasn't prohibitive of when we could bring everyone together. So we wanted to put this in your hands as soon as possible. So with that in mind, please join us for our continued series for our advocacy discussions, and we hope to engage with you soon. And take care.
Bye-bye.